Hi, welcome in. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge Family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
I stood near the back wall of the officers' club at Fort Bragg, holding a glass of soda I hadn't touched for the last 20 minutes. The room was loud in that specific way military celebrations always are forced. Laughter, clinking glasses, too many rank insignias packed into one space. A banner with my sister's name hung behind the podium. Congratulations, Major Brooke Miller, gold letters, perfect lighting, the kind of setup people plan weeks in advance. Brooke was in her element. She moved through the room like she owned it, shaking hands, smiling for photos, accepting praise she didn't bother to deflect. Her dress uniform was flawless, not a wrinkle, not a thread out of place. You could tell she'd practiced standing like that in the mirror, chin up, shoulders back, smile. Just humble enough to look earned. I hadn't practiced anything. I'd just shown up. I was still in uniform too. Captain, logistics, nothing flashy, no ribbons that would impress a crowd like this. I blended in easily, which was the point. I didn't come to celebrate. I came because family obligations don't care how tired you are or how long it's been since someone asked how you're holding up. People walked past me without noticing. A few junior officers nodded politely. One colonel glanced at my name tag. Paused like he was trying to place me, then moved on. I was used to that pause. It always ended the same way. Then Brooke picked up the microphone. Someone tapped a spoon against a glass, and the noise slowly died down. Conversations faded, heads turned, phones came out. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Brooke laughed into the mic like she was surprised by the attention, even though she'd been waiting for it all night. "Thank you," she said. "Seriously, this means a lot." Applause. Loud, long. She thanked her commanding officer, then her mentors, then her husband, Colonel Sterling Vance, who stood near the front with his arms crossed, smiling like a man who knew exactly how powerful he looked standing next to her. Then she said, "And of course my family." I felt it then, that tight pressure in my chest, the kind that shows up right before something goes wrong. "The Millers have always produced fighters," Brooke continued. "Warriors, leaders." She paused, scanning the room. "And then there's my sister." A few people chuckled, assuming this was going to be a light joke. A harmless family story. Brooke turned slightly, pretending to look for me. "Caitlin, are you still hiding back there?" A dozen heads turned in my direction. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. Brooke laughed. "There she is, Captain Caitlin Miller, logistics." She let the word hang like it explained everything. "You know," she said, leaning into the microphone, "every family has one system error. One person who just doesn't quite meet the standard." The room laughed, louder this time. "My sister tried to serve like the rest of us," Brooke went on. "But let's be honest, she's unfit to serve in the way that actually matters." I felt my jaw tighten, but my hands stayed still at my sides. "She's great with paperwork," Brooke added. "Amazing, really. Without people like her, heroes like me wouldn't have reports to sign." More laughter. Someone whistled. "She's exactly where she belongs," Brooke said, "cleaning up the mess so the rest of us can go make history." I looked past the crowd then, straight to my father. Retired General Harrison Miller stood near the head table, his posture stiff, his expression locked somewhere between embarrassment and approval. He didn't laugh. He didn't stop her either. He just looked at the floor for half a second, then back up at Brooke, nodding faintly like this was something that had to be said. That hurt more than the words. Brooke wasn't done. "She's always been like that," she said. "Working hard, staying quiet. Someone has to do the invisible jobs right." I noticed a few people shifting uncomfortably now. Not enough to matter. Brooke lifted her glass. "So let's raise one to the unsung support staff. And to knowing your limits." She took a sip, then she walked off the stage. Applause followed her, not as loud as before, but it was there. I thought that was the worst it would get. I was wrong. Brooke crossed the room toward me, still smiling, still riding the high. A small crowd followed her, curious. She stopped right in front of me. Up close, I could smell the wine on her breath. "You didn't clap," she said quietly. "I was listening," I replied. She smirked. Always so serious. Someone handed her another glass, red wine this time. She didn't look away from me as she took it. "You know," she said loud enough for the people nearest us to hear, "this could all end cleanly for you tonight." I didn't answer. Brooke tilted her head. "Voluntary separation paperwork." I already had it printed. She reached into a folder someone had handed her earlier and pulled out a document. Official, clean, my name typed neatly at the top. "I can save you years of embarrassment," she said. "Sign it. Leave quietly. Let the family move on." Before I could respond, she flicked her wrist. The wine splashed across my uniform, deep red against regulation green. It soaked into the fabric, ran down the front of my jacket, dripped onto the floor. The room went silent. Brooke gasped theatrically. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy." A few people laughed nervously, others looked away. She pressed the pen into my hand and pushed the paper against my chest, smearing wine onto it. "Sign," she said, "before you embarrass yourself any further." I looked down at the form, then back up at her. Then I looked at my father again. He didn't step in. He didn't say my name. He didn't tell her to stop. He just said, "Do the right thing, Caitlin." That was the moment something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clean. I didn't sign. I handed the pen back to Brooke carefully, like I was returning borrowed property. "I'm not resigning," I said. Her smile vanished. For the first time that night, Brooke looked angry. The silence in the room stretched thick and uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. A general near the podium checked his watch. Brooke leaned in close and whispered, "You should have stayed invisible." Then she turned away, already laughing again, already moving back toward the spotlight. I stood there soaked in wine, surrounded by people who suddenly found the floor very interesting. That was the night my sister decided I was unfit to serve. And it was the night I stopped trying to prove her wrong. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been the most capable person in the room, but treated like you were disposable because you didn't fit their version of success? If that sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. I stripped off the stained jacket that night and dropped it into the sink, watching the red swirl down the drain as I turned the water on. The fabric was ruined, but that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed was the sound of people laughing while my sister decided my worth out loud. Standing there alone, sleeves rolled up, I realized this wasn't new. It was just the first time she'd done it with a microphone. Brooke had always been loud. I'd always been useful. 10 years earlier, we'd both stood in the same recruiting office, our father seated between us like a judge. Brooke talked about leadership, about honor, about legacy. I talked about logistics systems and making sure people got home alive. The recruiter nodded at both of us, but my father only smiled at her. Brooke's path was smooth from the start. She landed in units that photographed well, training rotations with clean schedules and friendly commanders, deployments that came with press releases. Every assignment looked like it had been picked from a catalog titled, "How to Build a Hero." Mine didn't. I was sent where names didn't go on doors, places where your unit patch didn't mean anything outside a secure room. My orders never came with explanations, just coordinates and timelines. The kind of work where you learned fast or someone paid for it. While Brooke was posing for base newsletters, I was learning how to move supplies across hostile ground without drawing attention, how to reroute convoys when roads vanished overnight, how to read a situation without asking questions that wouldn't get answered. I didn't tell my parents any of that. They didn't ask. Every time Brooke came home on leave, there was a dinner, a toast. Stories repeated until they sounded bigger than they were. My mother would ask how long Brooke planned to stay. My father would ask about her next promotion board. They never asked why I slept sitting up, or why my shoulder didn't quite rotate the way it used to. Brooke learned early that words mattered more than work. She also learned she could borrow mine. The first time it happened, I didn't even realize it. We were both junior officers then. She called me late one night, said she was struggling with an after-action report. Asked if I could look at her draft. I rewrote half of it, corrected the analysis, tightened the language, sent it back without thinking. A week later, her commander praised her insight in front of the whole unit. She called to thank me, sounded proud. I told myself that was just how family worked. It kept happening. I'd send her threat assessments, logistics projections, risk breakdowns. She'd rephrase a paragraph, slap her name on it, and walk into briefings like she'd built the whole thing from scratch. Promotions followed, praise followed, magazine features followed. I followed orders. The worst part wasn't that she took credit. It was that she believed it. Somewhere along the way, Brooke convinced herself she was the one doing the thinking. That belief almost got people killed. We were supporting a recovery operation overseas. Hostage extraction, time sensitive. My unit handled the back-end planning. I flagged an issue with the route Brooke's team wanted to use, too exposed, too predictable. I sent the analysis up the chain. It landed on Brooke's desk. She ignored it. Instead, she went with a plan that looked good on a slide. Clean lines, simple arrows, easy to explain to visiting brass. The convoy hit resistance exactly where I said it would. I was already rerouting assets when the call came in. We shifted support, bought them a window, pulled everyone out. One operator took shrapnel. He lived. Brooke got commended for decisive leadership under pressure. She received a Bronze Star. My name never appeared in the report. When I saw the medal later framed in my parents' living room, my mother said, "Isn't it amazing how calm Brooke stays in a crisis?" I nodded. I didn't say anything about the blood on the radio that night, or the way my hands shook after. I learned something important over those years. Silence is easy to mistake for consent. And I was very good at staying silent. Every scar I earned came with a reason. Every long night had a purpose. But purpose doesn't photograph well, and it doesn't make for good speeches. Brooke understood optics. She understood timing. She understood how to stand in the light without doing the work that powered it. I understood consequences. While she climbed, I stayed where I was needed. The kind of assignments that don't end with ceremonies. The kind where you come back quieter than you left. By the time Brooke made major, people spoke her name like it meant something solid. They didn't know how much of it rested on other people's work. On mine. I didn't resent her success, not at first. I resented the lie. The version of reality everyone agreed to because it was convenient. The night of her promotion party didn't create that lie. It just confirmed that she'd never stop using it. As the water kept running in that sink, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, a face that didn't look like a cover story. I thought about every time I'd stepped aside to keep the peace. Every report I'd written that carried someone else's name. I shut the water off. For 10 years, I'd stayed in the background because I thought the work mattered more than recognition. I still believe that. But I was done letting someone else rewrite what I'd done to make themselves look better. Brooke wasn't a star. She was a mirror reflecting whatever made her shine the most. And I was done standing behind her holding the light. I folded the clean jacket and slid it into my duffel, then stopped when my phone buzzed on the metal table. The caller ID showed my mother's number. That alone told me it wasn't a casual check-in. She didn't waste time. "Your grandfather passed away. Silas Miller." The name sat there heavy and awkward like furniture no one wanted, but no one had thrown out either. In our family, he was always introduced with a pause. "Your grandfather, the one who left, the one who embarrassed the family during the war, the one we didn't talk about unless we had to." The funeral was small, quiet, no flags, no uniforms, just a rented chapel and a few stiff relatives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Brooke arrived late, sunglasses on, phone in hand. She hugged my mother for the benefit of anyone watching, then glanced around like she was assessing the square footage. My father didn't say much. He stood near the front, arms crossed, staring at the closed casket as if it had personally offended him. No one asked me to speak. I didn't volunteer. Afterward, we gathered in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and coffee gone cold. The will was short, efficient. Like Silas didn't believe in wasting words on people who had already made up their minds about him. Brooke inherited a beachfront house in Florida. She smiled for the first time that day. At least he did one thing right. I was handed a rough canvas bag. Old, faded. The kind of thing you'd use to haul tools, not memories. Inside were several rolls of undeveloped film and a USB drive that looked like it belonged in a museum. Brooke laughed, loud enough for the lawyer to glance up. "Trash to the useless," she said. "That tracks." I didn't respond. I just closed the bag and slung it over my shoulder. Back in my apartment that night, I spread the contents across the table. The film rolls were sealed and labeled with dates that didn't line up with any family timeline I knew. Locations written in shorthand. Nothing decorative, nothing sentimental. The USB caught my attention. It was old but not cheap. Solid casing, no branding. When I plugged it into my laptop, nothing happened. No prompt, no error, just silence. I turned it over in my hand and noticed a faint sensor strip along the edge. Biometric. I'd seen that design before, not in stores, in briefings that came with warnings about what not to mention outside the room. I pressed my thumb to the strip. The drive warmed slightly, my screen flickered. A login interface appeared plain and unremarkable, like it was trying not to be noticed. It accepted me. What opened wasn't a diary, it wasn't a confession, it was data. Logs, coordinates, operational notes written in a style I recognized immediately, concise, clinical, stripped of ego. Silas hadn't run, he'd disappeared. The files referenced something called Project Ghost. No dates I could search, no names I could say out loud. Just layers of compartmentalized work designed to vanish once it was done. I scrolled through page after page, my pulse steady, my mind sharp, in the way it only gets when everything starts to make sense at once. Silas had been embedded, off the books. His role was to exist where records couldn't, to solve problems that couldn't be acknowledged. He wasn't a disgrace. He was invisible on purpose. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. The tradecraft, the protocols, the logic behind the silence. It all felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain without admitting things about my own career that weren't supposed to connect. Then I found a folder with my name on it. Not my full name, just an initial, a designation. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't inheritance by chance. Silas hadn't left me scraps. He'd left me proof. I cross-checked timelines, missions I'd been assigned without explanation, orders that came from nowhere and ended without ceremony. The gaps in my official record suddenly had shape. I wasn't just following orders all those years, I was continuing his work. The family had called him a coward because cowards are easier to dismiss than truths you don't want to understand. Brooke had built her image on visibility. Silas had built his legacy on erasure. And somehow, I'd ended up walking the same path without ever being told its name. I shut the laptop and stared at the ceiling, letting the silence settle. For the first time in years, the weight I carried felt balanced. Not lighter, just aligned. Brooke's voice echoed in my head, laughing about trash and uselessness. She had no idea. The next morning, I packed the film and the drive back into the bag and locked it in a steel cabinet bolted to the wall. I didn't need to rush. The truth doesn't expire. What mattered was that I finally knew where I stood. My sister had spent her career standing in front of cameras. My grandfather had spent his life stepping out of frame. And I had been moving between those worlds unnoticed, exactly where I was supposed to be. Silas hadn't given me an apology. He'd given me context, and context changes everything. I unlocked the cabinet and pulled the canvas bag back out, setting it on the table like it weighed more than it did. My fingers hesitated for half a second before I powered up the laptop. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I knew I was done pretending this was just history. I logged back into the drive and went deeper than I had the night before. Silas hadn't organized his files emotionally. He'd organized them operationally. Layers within layers. Some folders only opened after others were verified. Cross-referenced keys. Time-delayed access. It wasn't paranoia. It was discipline. I followed the logic. That's when the pattern emerged. At first it looked like routine procurement data. Equipment logs, transfer approvals, serial numbers tied to surveillance hardware, drones, signal interceptors, mobile monitoring units. Nothing illegal on its own. Everything had signatures, clearances, paper trails, too clean. I started comparing them against deployment records and unit inventories. The numbers didn't match. Items approved for one theater never arrived. Others showed up where they weren't supposed to be. Equipment rotated out early, marked as damaged or obsolete, then quietly reassigned to private contractors with vague government ties. I pulled financial data next. Shell companies. Offshore accounts layered through jurisdictions that existed for one reason only. The names attached to them weren't junior officers or faceless administrators. They were familiar. Brooke Miller, Colonel Sterling Vance. My sister wasn't just cutting corners. She wasn't just lazy. She was selling access. The realization didn't hit me like a punch. It settled in like a weight I could finally define. All those years of borrowed credit, stolen reports, carefully curated bravery. It wasn't just ego. It was cover. Sterling had the connections. Brooke had the image. Together they moved equipment that was never meant to leave government control. Surveillance tools built for national security were ending up in private hands, leased back through contracts designed to look legitimate. They weren't heroes. They were vultures. I didn't rush. Rushing gets noticed. I mapped the network first. Every approval, every transfer, every signature. I flagged inconsistencies and ran them through multiple filters. Nothing I documented came from a single source. Everything overlapped. By the time I finished that pass, I wasn't guessing anymore. This wasn't a side hustle. It was a system, and it had been running for years. The most disturbing part wasn't the money, though. The sums were large enough to make anyone blink. It was how casually Brooke used family influence to grease the wheels. Calls logged late at night, messages sent through personal channels, pressure applied to officers who didn't yet know how to say no. I didn't record the first call. I listened. Brooke's voice hadn't changed. Confident, light, like she was asking a favor, not demanding compliance. "You want a future in this organization," she said to someone whose name I recognized as a recent graduate. "I can make things smooth, or complicated." There was laughter, hers. I started recording after that. Not illegally, not recklessly, every capture followed procedure. I documented context, timestamps, verification, nothing that couldn't stand up later. I built the file slowly, methodically, no emotion, just facts. Brooke never suspected me. She was too used to me staying out of her way, too comfortable assuming I'd keep cleaning up quietly. Sterling was more careful. He avoided direct language, spoke in suggestions and implications. He was the architect. Brooke was the face. Watching them work together felt like studying a case file where you already know the ending. There was no drama between them, no conflict, just efficiency. They trusted the system to protect them because the system had so far. As the evidence stacked up, so did something else I hadn't expected. Clarity. For years, I'd wondered why Brooke had pushed so hard to discredit me publicly, why she needed me small and silent. It wasn't just insecurity, it was risk management. I saw too much. I knew how things actually moved. I wasn't a threat because I was ambitious. I was a threat because I was competent. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every time she'd called me unfit, she'd been projecting. I saved redundant copies of everything, encrypted, distributed. If one location failed, others would remain. Silas had taught me that through his files without ever saying a word. I didn't confront Brooke. I didn't warn anyone. That would have been pointless. Instead, I waited. And while I waited, Brooke kept calling. She complained about ungrateful juniors, about officers who forgot who helped them. She dropped my father's name more than once like it was a credential instead of a warning sign. I let her talk. One call stood out. She was angry, not explosive, calculated. "If you don't sign off," she said, "I'll make sure your next assignment is somewhere you can't afford to fail." There was a pause on the other end. Fear, clear and audible. She smiled through the phone. I could hear it. That recording went into a separate folder. By the time I finished assembling the file, it was massive, cleanly indexed, every claim supported, every assumption eliminated. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, feeling nothing dramatic. No triumph, no rage, just readiness. Brooke had built her career by standing on other people's work and calling it leadership. Sterling had hidden behind rank and procedure, convinced no one would ever look closely enough. They were wrong. I shut the laptop and secured the drive again. The truth was no longer theoretical. It was documented, structured, patient, and it was waiting for the right moment to be seen. I felt it before anything actually happened. Not fear, not panic, just that quiet shift in the air you get when someone stops reacting and starts planning. Brooke didn't call for a few days. No casual complaints, no fake concern. Silence from her was never accidental. I tightened my routines, changed nothing obvious. I kept going to work, kept my head down, kept my tone neutral. If she thought I was watching her, the worst thing I could do was confirm it. The move came anyway. It was a Tuesday morning, early, too early for casual visits. I was reviewing shipment discrepancies when the door to my office opened without a knock. 2 military police stepped in first. Behind them was a CID agent I'd seen once before in passing. Calm face, clipboard, no curiosity, just procedure. "Captain Caitlin Miller," he said. "Please step away from the desk." I didn't argue. I stood slowly and folded my hands behind my back. They moved efficiently. One MP disconnected my workstation. The other photographed the desk, the shelves, the trash can. The CID agent slid a sealed evidence bag across the table and opened it just enough for me to see the label. Classified materials, weapons storage locations, deep storage. The kind of data that never sits on an unclassified machine. "I don't recognize that," I said. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. They escorted me out into the hallway. People stared. Some pretended not to. The looks were familiar curiosity mixed with relief that it wasn't them. In the lobby, my father was already there, So was Brooke. She stood close to him, one hand on his arm, eyes red like she'd been crying just enough. When she saw me, her face twisted into something that looked like pain. "I tried," she said to him, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I really tried to protect her. My father didn't look at me, not once. She sold us out." Brooke continued, "I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is right there." The CID agent explained the accusation. Treason, unauthorized possession of classified weapons data, intent to transfer, heavy words, carefully chosen. My father finally turned to me then. "Is it true?" he asked. "No," I said. That was it. One word. No speech. No plea. He exhaled sharply like I'd disappointed him by not trying harder. "You've disgraced this family," he said. "You're a stain that doesn't wash out." Then without hesitation he added, "You are no longer my daughter." There it was, clean, final, delivered in public like everything else that mattered to him. Brooke lowered her head against his shoulder, hiding a smile I caught just before she did. They cuffed me. The metal was cold. Standard issue. Tight enough to make a point, not tight enough to bruise. I'd warned them before on other people. I knew the feel. As they walked me across the base, conversation stopped when we passed. Vehicles slowed. Someone I'd worked with for years looked straight at me, then away. Brooke walked behind us for a few steps, heels clicking against the pavement. She leaned in close and whispered, "Goodbye, trash." There was laughter in her voice. Real laughter, uncontrolled. I didn't respond. They put me in a transport vehicle with no windows and no explanations. The engine started. The base disappeared behind us. Sitting there, hands cuffed, career burning down in real time. I didn't feel shock. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. The files hadn't been a coincidence. The silence hadn't been caution. Brooke hadn't just sensed me watching, she'd identified me as a threat and neutralized me the only way she knew how, by making me the story. At the holding facility, they took my belt, my watch, my rank. Each item placed into a tray like it was already evidence of something. The interrogation didn't start right away. They let time do its work. Fluorescent lights, a chair bolted to the floor, no clock. Eventually, 2 CID investigators entered. Different from the first, sharper, more curious. They laid out what they'd found, the files, the access logs, the timestamps, all clean, all damning. Someone had been careful. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I didn't interrupt. When they asked if I wanted a lawyer, I said yes. When they asked if I wanted to explain myself, I said no. That confused them. People accused of treason usually fall into 2 categories, loud or broken. I was neither. I sat there calmly because panic would have meant I didn't understand what was happening. I understood it perfectly. Brooke had set a trap that relied on reputation. Hers was untouchable. Mine was expendable. The system would always believe the decorated major over the quiet logistics officer, unless someone forced it to look closer. I waited. In the silence, I replayed my father's words. Not because they hurt, but because they clarified something I'd avoided admitting for years. I had never really been part of that family. I had just shared a last name. Hours passed, maybe more. No one told me. Finally, the door opened again. Not with accusations, not with threats, with hesitation. One of the investigators asked carefully, "Is there anyone you'd like us to notify?" "Yes," I said, "but not a lawyer." That caught their attention. I gave them a name they didn't expect. A rank they didn't expect. They exchanged looks. The trap had snapped shut around me exactly the way Brooke intended. Public, final, humiliating. What she didn't understand was that traps work both ways, and I had been preparing for this longer than she ever imagined. The room stayed quiet after I gave them the name, not awkward quiet. Calculating quiet. One of the investigators closed his notebook without saying anything. The other leaned back in his chair and studied me like I'd just changed the rules of a game he thought he understood. "I want to speak to General Benjamin Reed," I said again. "National Security." The shorter agent laughed. Not cruel, dismissive. "That's not how this works, Captain." I didn't correct my rank. I didn't argue. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table, breathing steady, eyes forward. "You're in custody for a serious offense," he continued. "You don't get to make requests." I nodded once. "Then this won't take long." That irritated him. I could see it. People expect desperation in rooms like this. Tears, bargaining, anger, silence that feels heavy. I gave them none of it. The taller agent leaned in. Why Reed? I looked at him. Because if you continue without him, you'll waste time building a case that collapses the moment it's reviewed above your pay grade. Another laugh. This one sharper. You're not in a position to threaten anyone, he said. I'm not threatening, I replied. I'm advising. They exchanged looks, the kind that said, let's see where she thinks this goes. The taller agent tapped his pen against the table. Fine, explain. I shook my head. Not here, not without Reed. Silence again. They stood up, left the room, and shut the door. No slam, no show, just procedure. I stayed where I was. I'd learned a long time ago that stillness unnerves people more than resistance. If you don't fill the space, they will. Minutes passed, or hours. It didn't matter. When they came back, they brought a different tone. Let's say the shorter agent began that we entertain this. What makes you think you're important enough to interrupt a general's schedule? I met his eyes. Because the case you think you're running isn't the case you're actually part of. He sighed impatient. You're accused of, I interrupted him for the first time, of possessing data that shouldn't exist on my machine. He paused. Correct, he said cautiously. That data didn't come from a leak, I continued. It came from a system that predates your investigation by decades. Now I had their attention. I leaned back slightly and recited the first set of numbers. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. The reaction was immediate. The taller agent froze. The other stopped writing. I followed with the second sequence, then the third. By the time I finished, no one was laughing. Those weren't random numbers. They were authentication markers. Old ones. The kind you don't find in manuals. The kind you only learn by being read in. The shorter agent cleared his throat. Where did you learn those? I didn't learn them, I said. I inherited them. They left the room again. Faster this time. I waited. Outside that building, Brooke was standing in front of a mirror, somewhere adjusting her uniform for another ceremony. I knew the routine by heart. The careful angle of the ribbons. The expression practiced to read confident, not smug. She thought the trap had closed. She thought I was done. That confidence had always been her weakness. She believed outcomes were permanent the moment people applauded them. The door opened again. This time, they didn't sit. You're being held pending further review, the taller agent said. No more questions for now. Good, I replied. They escorted me to a different room. Cleaner, smaller, no camera in the corner. That told me enough. Hours later, someone slid a tray of untouched food through a slot in the door. I didn't eat it, not out of protest, out of habit. I'd learned when to wait. The door finally opened near evening. A man entered alone, older, calm, no visible rank on his clothing, but his posture gave it away. He didn't look at the room. He looked at me. At ease, he said. I didn't move. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. You can relax. I uncuffed my hands from behind my back and rested them on the table. You asked for me, he said. I'm here. I met his gaze. It took you long enough. He smiled faintly. You weren't in immediate danger. That depends on your definition, I said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. You invoked credentials that haven't been used in years. Not publicly, I replied. Why now, he asked. Because someone tried to bury the truth under my name, I said. And because you don't build a system like this unless you expect it to be used when everything else fails. He watched me carefully. You're very calm for someone accused of treason. I'm calm because I know exactly who committed it, I said. And because I know how much damage they've already done. He didn't interrupt. I told him what I'd found. Not emotionally, not theatrically, just facts, structures, flows, names where necessary, proof where required. I didn't need to convince him. He already knew the outlines. What he needed was confirmation. When I finished, he stood without a word. You'll remain here, he said. For now. That was always the plan, I replied. As he reached the door, he paused. You understand what happens next won't be quiet. I nodded. It never is. He left. I sat alone again, listening to the hum of the building, thinking about Brooke stepping onto another stage, smiling for another camera, unaware that the ground under her had already shifted. She thought she'd erased me. What she'd done was isolate me. And isolation, when you're holding the truth, is leverage. I walked into the command office with my hands free, but my future already decided. At least that's what everyone in the room believed. The space was formal in the way only high-level military offices are. Polished wood, flags positioned just right, chairs aligned with quiet authority. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a place where outcomes usually came pre-written. My family was seated along one wall. My father sat straight-backed, eyes forward, expression carved from the same stone he'd used when he disowned me. My mother stared at her hands. Brooke stood near the table, centered, perfectly composed. Her dress uniform looked like it had been tailored an hour ago. Every ribbon sat exactly where it was supposed to. Confidence rolled off her like heat. She didn't look at me. An officer at the head of the table cleared his throat and read the charges again. Treason, mishandling classified material, intent to compromise national security. The words landed flat. They always do when the room already thinks it knows the ending. When he finished, he looked at me. "Captain Miller, do you have anything to say in your defense?" I didn't answer. That made Brooke smile. Silence stretched. Uncomfortable for them. Perfect for me. The officer shifted. "This is your opportunity." I reached down and set the canvas bag on the table. It made a dull sound. Nothing dramatic. Just weight meeting wood. Brooke glanced at it, amused. Probably expecting more trash. More proof that I didn't belong here. I opened the bag slowly. Not for effect. For control. Inside was the black velvet box Silas had left behind. Worn at the edges. Solid. Unassuming. I opened it, then I turned it upside down. The sound changed everything. Metal struck wood. Once, then again, heavy, final. The room seemed to inhale and forget how to exhale. 11 medals scattered across the table. Not replicas. Not commemorative junk. The real thing. Medals of honor. Silver stars. Purple hearts. Some scratched. Some pristine. All issued under classified operations. All bearing the same name. K. Miller. Brooke froze. My father leaned forward, eyes wide, as if he were seeing a ghost he'd spent his life denying. The officer at the head of the table stood up without realizing he was doing it. I still hadn't spoken. A few seconds passed, maybe more. Then the door opened. No announcement, no ceremony. A man entered who didn't need either. General Benjamin Reed walked in and stopped just inside the room. He looked at the medals, then at me. He came to attention and saluted. "Colonel Caitlin Miller," he said. "Welcome back from the dark." No one moved. Brooke's face drained of color, her mouth open then closed again. She looked at my father, waiting for him to say something. He didn't. The officer who'd been leading the proceedings stammered, "General, there must be some mistake." "There isn't," Reed replied calmly. He took a seat and motioned for the others to do the same. They obeyed without thinking. Rank does that to people. "These proceedings are suspended," Reed said. "Effective immediately." Brooke finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Those medals, those could belong to anyone." Reed looked at her then. Not angrily, not accusingly, like an instructor evaluating a failed argument. "They belong to an operative who worked under multiple designations," he said. "Assignments so sensitive they never made it into standard personnel files." He nodded toward me. "That operative is sitting right there." My father stood up abruptly. "My daughter is a logistics officer." "She is many things," Reed replied. Logistics was a cover. The word hung in the air like a dropped weapon. Brooke laughed, sharp and brittle. "You expect us to believe she's some kind of hero?" She can," Reed interrupted. And she did. He turned to the table and picked up one of the medals. These weren't awarded for speeches or visibility. They were awarded for outcomes, the kind you never hear about. He set it back down carefully. "Caitlin Miller was read into a compartmented program years ago," he continued. "One designed to operate without recognition, without promotion, without public validation." My mother covered her mouth. Brooke shook her head, backing away slightly. "No, that's not possible. I would have known." Reed's gaze sharpened. "That assumption is part of the problem," I finally spoke. "You didn't know," I said, my voice steady. "Because you never asked." Brooke turned on me. "You think this erases what you did, the files they found on your computer?" Reed answered that one. "Those files were planted. We've already confirmed the access points and timing." He slid a folder across the table toward her. "And while we're correcting the record," he added, "we'll be discussing your activities as well." Sterling's name came up then. Quietly, deliberately, Brooke's confidence collapsed in stages. First denial, then anger, then calculation. She tried to speak, but nothing came out right. I watched her, not with satisfaction, but with distance. The way you observe a structure failing exactly where the stress fractures always were. My father sank back into his chair. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Brooke. He stared at the medals like they'd rewritten his entire understanding of loyalty and legacy in one afternoon. Reed turned to me. You'll remain on temporary hold while we complete the rest of the review, he said, but your status is restored. I nodded. Understood. The room stayed silent after that. No applause, no closure, just the sound of a truth finally spoken aloud, and a family forced to hear it without filters. I gathered the medals back into the box and closed it, carefully, because some things don't need to be displayed to be real. I connected the drive to the system without saying a word. The screen lit up behind me large enough that no one in the room could avoid it. I stood slightly to the side, not blocking the view, not claiming the moment. The evidence didn't need help. The first file opened automatically. A procurement authorization form filled the screen, clean layout, official formatting. At a glance, it looked legitimate. Then the overlay appeared. Highlighted sections, timestamps, a signature block magnified in the corner, Brooke's signature, forged, not a sloppy imitation, careful, practiced. The kind of forgery done by someone who'd signed enough documents to know exactly how much pressure to apply. A murmur rippled through the room. I clicked to the next file. Security footage, grainy but clear enough. My office, late evening. The camera angle shifted as Brooke entered using credentials that should never have opened that door. She moved quickly, efficiently, plugged a device into my workstation, typed, waited, removed it. She glanced at the door once before leaving. The room went silent. Brooke stepped forward. That's fake, she said too fast. That can't be real. I didn't look at her. The next screen showed transaction logs, account numbers, transfers broken into manageable chunks routed through shell companies designed to blur ownership. The totals were displayed at the bottom. 7 figures, then 8. Sterling's name appeared beside hers. Linked accounts, shared access. Someone behind me exhaled sharply. Brooke laughed. A sharp, panicked sound. You think this proves anything anyone can make numbers appear on a screen? I turned then, slowly. You taught me that, I said. Presentation matters. She lunged. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't calculated. It was pure rage. The kind that erupts when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves no longer has an audience. 2 MPS caught her before she reached me. She screamed, thrashing against their grip. Her voice cracking as the room watched the image of her unravel. Liar, she shouted. She's lying. No one answered her. My mother had gone pale. Her hands shook in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the screen. Like if he didn't look away, the truth might rearrange itself into something easier to live with. I shut the display off. The sudden darkness felt appropriate. This isn't about humiliation, I said. My voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. It's about accountability. Brooke was still shouting when they dragged her toward the door. Accusations, threats, promises that people would regret this. None of it landed. She disappeared down the hall, her words trailing off into nothing. The room felt smaller after that, like everyone had shifted closer to themselves. I turned to my father. He flinched when our eyes met. You wanted a hero, I said, someone you could point to, someone who made you look good. He swallowed hard, didn't respond. I wanted a father who trusted me, I continued, who asked questions instead of making assumptions. We didn't get what we wanted. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They were simply true. My father looked down at his hands. For the first time, I could remember he didn't have anything prepared to say. No one moved to comfort him. Reed stood and addressed the room. This session is concluded. Further proceedings will continue under separate authority. People began to file out quietly. No one met my eyes. Not out of contempt, out of discomfort. It's hard to stand near someone when the illusion you believed in collapses that completely. I packed the drive away carefully, slid it back into the bag. The medals stayed closed in their box. They had done their job. As I turned to leave, my mother whispered my name. I paused, but I didn't turn around. I didn't know, she said. We didn't know. I nodded once. You didn't want to. That was all. Outside, the air felt colder, cleaner. I stood there for a moment, letting my shoulders drop. Not in relief, in acceptance. The story was no longer mine to carry alone. Brooke had built her life on being seen, on applause and admiration and borrowed brilliance. The moment the spotlight moved, there was nothing underneath holding her up. I walked away without looking back. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to prove. I wasn't in the room when the sentence was read. I didn't ask to be there. 25 years. That was the number people focused on when they told me what happened to Brooke. They said it like it was a measurement of justice, like time alone could balance everything she'd taken. Her husband lost his rank the same day. His name stripped from the walls where it used to mean something. Their accounts frozen, properties seized. The life they'd built on shortcuts collapsed in a single season. I felt nothing dramatic when I heard it. No satisfaction, no relief. Just finality. My father's outcome took longer. Investigations always do when the subject knows how to hide behind silence. But silence doesn't protect you forever. It only delays the moment when people stop returning your calls, when invitations dry up, when former colleagues cross the street instead of shaking your hand. He wasn't convicted of treason. He didn't need to be. He was quietly removed from advisory roles. Committees replaced him without ceremony. His name stopped appearing on programs. For a man who'd lived on reputation, that absence was its own sentence. We never spoke again. The military offered me a promotion not long after everything settled. A clean slate, a public correction, a chance to finally stand where people could see me. I declined. That confused them more than anything else I'd done. I'd spent most of my career operating in places where rank was irrelevant and credit didn't exist. I didn't need a new title to validate work that was already done. And I didn't want to spend the rest of my service explaining myself to people who had just learned my name. So I retired early, not in protest, not in anger, by choice. I used the last thing my grandfather left me, the one thing that mattered, to build something that didn't need permission to exist. The Silas Foundation started small, a few desks, a phone line that actually got answered. Paperwork handled without judgment. Resources directed toward veterans who'd done everything right and still ended up forgotten. No cameras, no banners, just work. Men and women who didn't look like heroes on magazine covers walked through the door every week. Some carried injuries you could see. Others carried things that never showed up on scans. They didn't need speeches. They needed someone to take them seriously. That was something I knew how to do. Sometimes people asked why I didn't name the foundation after myself, why I didn't lean into my story more, why I didn't cash in on the attention while it was there. I told them the truth. The story was never the point. My grandfather spent his life being called a disgrace because he disappeared when people wanted a spectacle. He understood something most of us learn too late, that real service doesn't always come with witnesses. I'd lived that lesson without realizing it had a name. I never visited Brooke in prison, not out of spite. There was just nothing left to say. We'd spoken our truths already, and hers had finally caught up with her. Sometimes late at night, I thought about the version of us that might have existed if things had gone differently. If competition hadn't replaced trust, if silence hadn't been mistaken for weakness. Then I let those thoughts pass. They weren't useful. The work was, when people recognized me now, it wasn't because of medals or headlines. It was because something they needed finally moved forward. A form processed. A call returned. A problem solved without fanfare. That was enough. I learned that legacy isn't something you inherit or perform. It's what remains after the noise fades. It's the quiet proof that you showed up when no one was watching and did the job anyway. That's the part they don't teach in ceremonies. If there's one thing I know for certain, it's this. The value of a soldier isn't measured by photographs or applause. It's measured by what they do when credit isn't available. And silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It's discipline. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you believe justice matters even when it's inconvenient, take a second to like and subscribe. And tell me this. What would you do if your family valued reputation more than your life? I'm reading the comments. I didn't learn the value of silence from a book or a mentor. I learned it by watching what happened when I spoke too early, explained too much, or tried to prove something to people who had already decided who I was. For a long time, I thought staying quiet meant I was losing. That's what the world tells you. If you don't speak up, you don't matter. If you don't defend yourself immediately, you must be guilty. If you don't react, you must be weak. None of that is true. Silence can be fear, but silence can also be discipline. The difference isn't how it looks from the outside. The difference is intent. There were moments in my life when I stayed quiet because I was afraid of consequences. That kind of silence shrinks you. It teaches people that pressure works. It invites more disrespect. But there were other moments when I stayed quiet because I understood the room better than the people talking. Because I knew that words once spent can't be reused. And because I understood something most people learn too late, not every situation is asking for your voice. Some are waiting for your timing. In work environments, especially competitive ones, silence is often misread. If you don't interrupt, you're ignored. If you don't self-promote, someone else will promote themselves using your work. If you don't defend every accusation, the narrative fills the gap without you. That's the trap. People rush to talk because they're afraid of being erased. They rush to explain because they want control back. But when you explain too soon, you give your opponent information. When you react emotionally, you give them leverage. I've watched capable people destroy their own credibility by trying to clear their name before they understood the full picture. They spoke to be heard, not to be effective. Silence, when chosen deliberately, does the opposite. It slows the other side down. It forces them to reveal more. It creates space for patterns to emerge. This applies far beyond the military. If you've ever worked in an office where credit mysteriously travels upward, you know this feeling. You bring solutions. Someone else brings confidence. When praise comes, it skips over you like you were never in the room. The instinct is to call it out immediately, to correct the record in public. Sometimes that works. Most of the time, it just marks you as difficult. Silence doesn't mean acceptance. It means documentation. It means observation. It means choosing the moment when the truth can no longer be brushed aside as opinion. The same rule applies in families. Some families don't want honesty. They want balance. And by balance, they mean silence from the person who disrupts their preferred version of reality. If you've ever been told, "Why can't you just let it go?" or "Do we really need to talk about this?" what they're asking for isn't peace. It's compliance. Speaking in those moments rarely fixes anything. It just labels you as the problem. Silence in those cases isn't surrender. It's self-respect. It's refusing to perform emotional labor for people who benefit from misunderstanding you. But silence only works if it's paired with action. Quiet doesn't mean passive. Quiet means focused. When I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds, I freed up energy for things that actually mattered. I started paying attention instead of reacting. I started preparing instead of protesting. That's when the balance shifted. There's a dangerous myth that confidence is loud. Real confidence doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't rush. It doesn't beg for agreement. It waits. If you're watching this and thinking, "That sounds nice, but I can't afford to stay quiet," I understand. Silence isn't always safe. There are times when you must speak immediately, when harm is happening, when boundaries are being crossed, when legal or physical danger is present. This isn't about staying silent at all costs. It's about knowing the difference between urgency and impulse. Ask yourself this before you respond to conflict. Am I speaking to clarify, or am I speaking to be validated? If it's the second one, pause. Validation feels good, but it rarely changes outcomes. Clarity does. Another question that matters: is this person capable of hearing the truth, or are they invested in misunderstanding me? If they're invested in misunderstanding you, silence protects you. It denies them the reaction they're looking for. It keeps you from handing them ammunition. One of the hardest lessons I learned was this: you don't owe everyone an explanation, especially not people who benefit from your confusion. Silence becomes powerful when it's paired with boundaries. You stop oversharing. You stop correcting every false assumption. You stop auditioning for fairness. Instead, you document. You prepare. You build leverage quietly. And when you finally speak, you don't argue. You state facts, calmly, precisely, once. That moment doesn't look dramatic. It looks inevitable. If there's one practical takeaway I want you to hold on to, it's this: don't confuse being unheard with being powerless. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who hasn't said anything yet. They're not lost, they're not weak, they're not behind. They're waiting for the moment when words will actually matter. And when that moment comes, silence turns into something else entirely. There's a line people don't like to talk about, not in public, not at family dinners, not even in therapy sometimes. It's the line where loyalty to your family starts costing you your self-respect. Most people cross it without realizing they've done it. I did. Growing up, I was taught that family came first, not as a suggestion, as a rule. You protect your own, you keep problems inside. You don't embarrass the family, you don't challenge authority, you endure. That sounds noble until you realize what it actually trains you to do. It trains you to absorb damage quietly. In families like mine, loyalty wasn't about care. It was about image. We weren't protecting each other, We were protecting a story. And if you threatened that story even by telling the truth, you became the problem. That's how unhealthy systems survive. They don't need everyone to lie. They just need the most capable person to stay quiet. For years, I believed that putting up with unfair treatment was maturity, that being the reasonable one meant letting things slide. That if I just worked harder, stayed calmer, proved myself long enough, eventually I'd be seen. That day never comes. Families that demand sacrifice but refuse accountability aren't confused. They're organized. They know exactly who benefits when you keep the peace, and it's rarely you. There's a difference between compromise and erasure. Compromise asks both sides to adjust. Erasure asks only one person to disappear emotionally so everyone else can stay comfortable. If you've ever been told, "Why do you always make things difficult when all you did was speak honestly?" you know this dynamic. The message isn't that your concern is invalid. It's that your presence is inconvenient. What makes family dynamics especially dangerous is the language they use. They don't say, "Be quiet so we can keep controlling the situation." They say, "Do it for the family." They wrap pressure in tradition. They call obedience love. And when you push back, they don't argue facts. They question your character. You're too sensitive. You're holding grudges. You're tearing the family apart. None of those statements address the issue. They're designed to redirect blame. I learned that family loyalty becomes toxic the moment it requires you to doubt your own reality. The moment you start asking yourself whether you're wrong for noticing patterns, for remembering what happened, for feeling hurt by things that would hurt anyone. That's not unity. That's conditioning. One of the hardest realizations I had was this: some families don't want reconciliation. They want compliance. Reconciliation requires accountability. Compliance just requires your silence. When I finally stopped playing my role, everything shifted. Not because I became cruel or distant, but because I stopped negotiating my worth. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. That didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. Here's something most people won't tell you. Setting boundaries with family often feels worse than setting boundaries with strangers. Because strangers don't have access to your childhood. They don't know which buttons to press. They don't get to rewrite your history. Family does. They know exactly which guilt to activate, which memory to weaponize, which version of you to drag out when you don't comply. That's why self-respect feels like betrayal at first. You've been trained to associate discomfort with wrongdoing. But discomfort is not a moral failure. It's a signal that something needs to change. Respecting yourself doesn't mean cutting everyone off. It means deciding what behavior you will no longer tolerate, even from people you love. Especially from people you love. Love without respect isn't love. It's dependency. If you're struggling with this, start small. You don't need speeches. You don't need ultimatums. You don't need permission. You need clarity. Ask yourself one question. If this person weren't family, would I accept this behavior? If the answer is no, the problem isn't you. Another hard truth: you cannot heal a family system by sacrificing yourself. All you do is teach it that your pain is an acceptable cost. When I stopped trying to earn fairness from people who needed me small, I stopped being useful to their narrative. That's when the pressure increased. That's also when I knew I was doing something right. Healthy relationships don't require you to betray yourself to maintain peace. They adapt, they listen, they adjust. Unhealthy ones punish you for changing. If your growth is treated like a threat, you're not in a relationship. You're in a hierarchy. Choosing self-respect doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop participating in your own erosion. And yes, there's loss, sometimes distance, sometimes silence. Sometimes the relationship never recovers. But here's what you gain: stability, clarity, the ability to look at yourself without flinching. That's not selfish. That's foundational. Family loyalty is meaningful when it's mutual, when it protects everyone, not just the loudest or most admired, when it doesn't require one person to carry all the weight so others can stay comfortable. If your family asks you to choose between belonging and being whole, choose wholeness. Belonging that costs you your integrity isn't belonging at all. It's a contract designed to keep you small, and you were never meant to live that way. For a long time, I thought success had a sound. Applause, recognition, someone saying your name in a room where it matters. That's how we're trained to recognize progress. If people see you winning, you must be winning. That belief is everywhere, in offices, in families, online. Success is loud. it posts updates. It collects reactions. It proves itself daily so no one forgets it exists. I used to think if you weren't visible, you were replaceable. I don't believe that anymore. What changed wasn't my definition of success. It was my understanding of what survives when attention disappears. I've met people with impressive titles who couldn't function without validation. The moment the spotlight moved, they unraveled. Their confidence depended on being watched. Their identity depended on approval. I've also met people no one ever talks about who quietly keep systems running. When they're gone, everything breaks. No one applauds them. No one celebrates them. But everyone feels the loss. That's real success, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. We live in a culture that confuses exposure with value. If something is visible, it must matter. If it's quiet, it must be insignificant. That mindset doesn't just distort ambition, it exhausts people. You start performing instead of building. You start curating instead of growing. You start measuring your life by reactions instead of results. And you never feel done. Because performative success is hungry. It always needs more proof. I saw that hunger up close. I watched people chase promotions they didn't actually want just to keep pace with someone else. I watched relationships become competitive. I watched people sacrifice their health, their integrity, their peace just to stay impressive. They weren't chasing fulfillment. They were chasing reassurance. There's nothing wrong with being recognized. Recognition can open doors. It can protect you. It can amplify good work. But when recognition becomes the goal instead of the byproduct, everything warps. You stop asking, is this meaningful? You start asking, will this be seen? When I chose to step away from a career path that offered visibility, people assumed I was giving something up, that I was walking away from success. What I was actually doing was redefining it. I wanted a life where my value didn't fluctuate based on who was paying attention, where my work didn't need to be explained constantly to be justified, where I wasn't required to sell myself to feel secure. That decision confused people who measured worth externally. It made perfect sense to people who were tired. Here's the truth most people don't want to admit: if your success depends on being noticed, it's fragile. Anyone louder, flashier, or more aggressive can take it from you. But if your success is built on competence, reliability, and quiet impact, it's durable. It holds when trends change. When attention moves, when applause stops, that kind of success doesn't compete, it compounds. In practical terms, this means choosing depth over display. It means picking work where you're needed, not just admired. Relationships where you're understood, not just celebrated. Goals that align with who you are, not who you're trying to impress. It also means letting go of the need to constantly explain your choices. People who benefit from spectacle will always misunderstand those who choose substance. That's not your problem. If you're watching this and wondering whether you're chasing the wrong thing, ask yourself a simple question. If no one ever praised this, would I still do it? If the answer is yes, you're probably on the right path. Another question that matters: if I stop talking about this, would it still matter? Real success doesn't disappear when the conversation ends. One of the most freeing realizations I've had is that you don't need to prove your worth to people who don't understand your priorities. You don't need to win arguments about your life choices. You don't need universal approval. You need alignment. When your actions match your values, you stop needing external permission. You stop explaining yourself. You stop performing confidence and start living it. That's when things quiet down. And quiet, contrary to what we're told, is not empty. Quiet is stable. Quiet is sustainable. Quiet is where real work happens. If you build a life that only makes sense when others are watching, you'll spend your entire life looking over your shoulder. But if you build a life that still holds when no one is paying attention, you'll have something no one can take from you. Success isn't about being seen. It's about being useful, consistent, and whole. Everything else is just noise. And when the noise fades, what you've built in the quiet is what remains.
Final note: this story is a work of fiction created by artificial intelligence to heighten drama and emotion. But the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.